The Pareto Principle with Team 7. We will take a little deeper dive into the Pareto Principle to look at its origin, how it can be used in business, a breakdown of the principle and why it's important, and we will also look at a few real-life examples and some issues that arise when applying the principle. So how can the Pareto Principle help you in life or business? We must first look at what the Pareto Principle is. The Pareto Principle, or 80-20 rule, was first expressed in 1906 by economist Vilfredo Pareto, who introduced the principle that 80% of the deliverables from a project are achieved with only 20% of the effort, which in turn results in the remaining 20% requiring 80% of the effort. Although it was Pareto who introduced the concept, it was Joseph Juran who popularized the principle as a rule that can be used for multiple contexts and uses. If applying the 80-20 rule to your life, it is important to keep in mind that the focus shifts on areas that will have the biggest impact on the end goal. In business, the focus is on what will be the biggest contribution to the business. Today, project managers know that 20% of the work will consume 80% of the time and resources, and of that 20% of work, 10% will be at the beginning of the project and 10% at the end. Some examples of this are that 80% of revenues are generated by 20% of the customers. 80% of complaints come from 20% of your customers, and 80% of quality issues impacts 20% of a company's product. With the Pareto Principle, it has various ways it can be incorporated into everyday life. Let's look at a breakdown of some of those principles on the next slide. In 1906, Vilfredo Pareto noticed that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by only 20% of the population, and wanted to know why and how this rule of thumb would work concerning efficiency, and why does this rule seem to continually occur. This video clip from Mind Your Decisions expands upon this rule even further.
The 80-20 rule is a good rule of thumb so that you can focus on only 20% of the causes to improve 80% of the results. But why does it happen? Let's do an experiment to find out. We'll start our experiment with 100 paper clips. We'll mix them into a pile and select 2 paper clips at random. We'll join those paper clips into a chain and then we'll put them back into the pile. We'll repeat the experiment by selecting 2 paper clips at random and joining them into a chain. We'll repeat this experiment over and over again, each time joining paper clips into chains if we selected them randomly. Over time, there will be some chains of paper clips which get very long. In fact, chains which are longer will be more likely to get picked, and they'll form even longer chains. After we repeat this experiment over and over again, we can look at the distribution of paperclip chains. Because the longer chains are more likely to get picked, this is an example of how the rich can get richer. In our distribution of paperclip chains, there will be many paperclips that are single and by themselves, and a few paperclips which are very long chains. And this is where the 80-20 rule can be illustrated. 80% of the paperclips belong to the top 20% of the longest chains. In fact, if we were to graph out the data, we would find what's known as a power law, where there are a lot of paperclips that have a very small size, but there are a few paperclips that have very high valued size and take up a majority of the paperclips. This type of graph is also seen with income distribution. Now we know why the 80-20 rule happens. It's an emergent phenomenon from a process wherever the rich get richer. The 80-20 rule is also a pretty good rule of thumb for efficiency.
The Pareto principle can be applied in many different areas of business such as sales, marketing, and technology. However, this principle can also be applied to everyday life situations. In sales and marketing, you might find that 80% of sales come from 20% of your clients, or that 80% of sales come from 20% of your products, or even that 80% of your complaints come from 20% of your customers. In reference to technology, you might find that 80% of software problems are caused by 20% of bugs, or that 80% of customers only use 20% of software features. In wealth management, this could be applied to show how 80% of the wealth is owned by 20% of the people. Few people thought to apply the 80-20 principle to everyday life or the ramifications it could have. For example, what is the 20% of your possessions you get the most value out of? What do you spend 20% of your time doing that gives you 80% of your happiness? Who are the 20% of people you're close to who make you the happiest? What are the 20% of the clothes you wear 80% of the time? What's the 20% of food you eat 80% of the time? Chances are these are easy questions for you to answer. You've just never considered them before. Once you've answered them, you can easily focus on increasing the efficiencies in your life. The problem with the Pareto principle is that the definition states for many events, and this can apply to whatever situation a person desires. 80-20 is true for what Pareto is saying. Does it really equal 100? Investopedia.com gave an example which states 30% of the workforce, or 30 out of 100 workers, may only complete 60% of the output. The remaining workers may not be as productive or may just be slacking off on the job. The Pareto principle is not useful if a person is already working to their fullest potential. Although you may have ratios that are different than 80-20, the principle still applies. It helps provide insight into what needs fixed or where others should receive more recognition or attention. It provides a means for evaluating tasks and projects so you identify those that will have the greatest impact. In projects, it helps you evaluate risks so you can be watching for those that may have the largest negative impact. We hope you now understand this principle better, and thank you for watching.